and sustainable development. So I'm going to begin with a quick overview of sustainable development. Sorry, technical fun here. Is this going to work? Well, we've got a picture. Unfortunately, it's not the picture we want. So let's see if we can change that. I should have gone with the advice of the organisers, which was to use their computer. So what's happened is that this is now thinks that this is my second screen, so I'm going to have to fart around for a couple of seconds. Excuse me while we deal with this minor technical difficulty. So let's have this as the okay. Yeah, I think that's the only one. Let's just say duplicate. That'll probably do it.
I would just note that in the old days, we used to burn out the bulbs in the slide projector.
There you go. Okay. Yeah, we're definitely moving on. Okay, so climate change and sustainable development. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what is sustainable development, and then talk about what are the likely impacts of climate change. Because if we're concerned about the relationship between climate change and sustainable development, we want to look at how we can sustain development in the context of climate change. I'll then talk about the most cost-effective way of addressing the impacts of climate change, which is necessarily also the most sustainable. And then I'll end with a question about the alternative ways of addressing climate change that are currently dominant in our political discourse. So sustainable development goes back a fairly long way. I mean, the idea of sustainability can be traced at least to models of fisheries in the 1950s. It got brought into the mainstream environmental debate most cogently with a document from 1987, which was the World Commission on Environment and Development that was headed by Gro Harlem Brundtland, known as the Brundtland Commission. And there they defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is pretty much motherhood and apple pie, difficult to object to sustainable development defined that way. So what does it mean in the context of climate change? Well, here's just a very short slide outlining what are the putative impacts of climate change. So if you look down, you can see a series of hypothesized impacts, increased precipitation, increased incidence of storms, and so on. And then on the right, I've given you only a very brief assessment of whether there is evidence to justify a concern in that regard. So there's a hypothesized impact of increased precipitation. Turns out that in a warmer world, it probably would get a little bit wetter. There's a hypothesized impact of increased incidence of storms and hurricanes. The evidence does not support that right now. There's a hypothesized impact of an increased rate of reduction in glaciers. The evidence does not support that right now. There's a hypothesized impact of an increased rate of sea level rise. The evidence does not support that right now. There is a hypothesized impact of more hot days and fewer cold days. Well, yes, the evidence does support that. And by the way, the fewer cold days probably dominate in terms of their impact on health outcomes. If you make it warmer in the winter, then the deaths that arise from people succumbing previously to hypothermia don't materialize in the same number. Meanwhile, it's relatively easier to address deaths from heat using fairly simple technologies. So the death impact of this would probably be a kind of a net reduction. Increased disease, not good evidence for that. Lots of hypotheses out there, but they're not well supported by the evidence that's available. And change in the range of species, yes, that probably would happen in a warmer world. Not clear that it would be necessarily particularly harmful, though. So given all of those hypothesized impacts, is cutting carbon emissions a sensible way to address climate change? Well, this can be addressed most efficiently in a simple graph that was produced by Bjorn Lomborg 11 years ago, which he showed the difference in the amount of emissions the difference in temperature that would materialize as a result of applying the Kyoto Protocol as originally conceived all the way through to 2100. So if you kept the emissions in wealthy countries down to 5% below their 1990 levels until 2100, and looking and assuming that the then IPCC second assessment report median warming scenario was valid, you would delay warming by a few weeks, essentially, as a result of keeping Kyoto going. So not a significant reduction in warming. And to the extent that warming is a concern, it's not clear that the now estimated $180 billion a year that applying just Kyoto would cost is really worth the money. Meanwhile, it is, and I think I've been arguing this since now 1992, worth looking at an alternative way of addressing climate change, which is adaptation. Yes, you could try and address it by cutting back on carbon emissions. It's not clear that that's the best way of doing things. It turns out that humanity is actually pretty good at adapting to climate. In fact, you could see in some respects our entire evolutionary history as a form of adaptation to the climate in which we live. So let's quickly look at a few of the problems that are associated with climate change and more widely. Malaria and dengue, actually the evidence is unclear as to whether these things would become worse as a result of climate change. But we do know that we can address them today using technologies that are available now. Pesticides and air conditioning in particular are very good at significantly reducing the incidence of both of these problems if used correctly, and they can have minimal impact environmentally. Diarrheal diseases, a leading cause of death in poorer countries, can be addressed very effectively with clean water and sanitation, as well as relatively simple medical interventions such as the use of oral rehydration salts. Flooding, and a result of increased precipitation, if that it becomes a significant problem, can be addressed using readily available current technologies, including flood barriers, building houses on stilts, and if the worst comes to the worst, migration. Human societies have been migrating really since the first humans emerged in Africa 100,000 or so years ago. Heat exhaustion, let's go back to the problem that might result from an increase in the number of hot days. Well, you can introduce fans, again, air conditioning. You can have more effective building structures that enable you to address that problem. Crop damage, a lot has been made of the putative impact that might occur on agriculture as a result of a warming world. Not only because it would be hotter, but because you'd have a change in precipitation and so on, and some places would become more arid. Well, scientists have been developing over the past couple of decades technologies, new crop varieties that are quite effective in dealing with these different environments. There are crops that have been developed already that can deal with drier, hotter, wetter, and more saline conditions. Sadly, many of these crops are having difficulty going through the regulatory process or aren't being put through the regulatory process because the locations in which they would be most useful are places where people are poor, where the regulatory environment is opaque, and it's become not viable in many cases to put them through. Even a potentially wonderful technology called golden rice, which was developed by Swiss researcher Ingo Petraikas and his assistant, which would make available to a large swathe of the world's population increased access to provitamin A. Vitamin A deficiency results in blindness in hundreds of thousands of people every year, and yet this new technology is not being made available because of the regulatory restrictions that are being introduced largely as a result of lobbying by environmental organizations. Changes in range of species to the extent that they're an issue, and I think it's likely that they would be something of an issue, can also be addressed most effectively by using managing technologies that are available today, but also not widely used. So improving the incentives for the sustainable management of species in their current realm is likely to be the most cost-effective way of addressing that problem. We can talk about that more in Q&A if you want. So very quickly, here is some graphs showing the relationship now between health and wealth, which I think gives you an insight into how important it is to enable people to have access to new technologies and generally enable them to gain wealth. Clearly, there's a significant improvement that occurs around $250 to $500 per capita per year. And a large part of that, as you can see from this graph, is a result of increased access to potable water. Where people don't have access to potable water, they die from horrible diseases early in their life. Many people die from horrible diseases early in their life. Fortunately, we've, over the past couple of hundred years, really improved the conditions for the poor as a result of dramatic and rapid economic growth. So here you can see economic growth from 1 AD to 2005. It's carried on, by the way. And you can see that clearly not much happened between the first century and 1500, then gradually got better, mostly in Europe, although things have been better previously in China. And then dramatically in about 1800 as the engine of economic growth got going. In the past couple of hundred years, you've seen a dramatic reduction in the proportion of poor. You've seen, as a result of technological progress and trade, improvements in the health in places that haven't themselves necessarily got significantly wealthy or proportionally wealthier. So Egypt, Algeria, China and Bangladesh, well, China's perhaps an exception there, but all the other countries have seen dramatic falls in infant mortality, disproportionate falls in infant mortality compared to their improvements in health, in wealth. You've seen rises in nutrition across the board pretty much, although less so in Africa. You've also seen dramatic reductions in death rates as GDP has risen over the course of the past 100 years. Death rates from extreme weather. So this is, one of the putative concerns that's raised in relation to climate change is a rise in deaths from extreme weather. Well, it turns out that both deaths and death rates from extreme weather events have fallen dramatically since 1920, largely as a result of new technologies and wealth, which enables people to adapt. So overall, you've seen a rise in life expectancy over the course of the past 50, 60 years. And it brings us to the conclusion, I think, that if we're really serious about addressing all these problems which are related to climate change, we should not focus on addressing climate change directly. We should focus on improving the ability of people to adapt to climate change and all of the other problems that might arise in the next few decades. And that means economic development. But with carbon control, as Chris has already said, resources will be diverted into low carbon technologies and away from other technologies that might better enhance people's lives. It also legitimizes the imposition of the very barriers which are currently holding back people in poorer countries. So people in poor countries will be less wealthy and they will be less able to adapt to whatever changes occur in the future. And this is a picture taken by my wife in 2001. I was on the trip too, so I can tell you this is a place just about a mile from the Taj Mahal in India, in Agra, and you can see a small child collecting dried dung and putting it in a pile, and on the right you can see the smokiness. You can sort of see it around her as well, but you can see the smokiness emerging from these huts. Well, the consequence of living like this is that about 300,000 children a year die in India as a result of indoor air pollution. And I'm not even going to talk about the unpleasant effects of children manipulating dung. Around the world, over 1 million children and women die from indoor air pollution, which is a direct consequence of burning wood and dung in poorly flued fires. This is a problem that can be solved really quite simply by using modern technologies, using gas-fired sources of heat or electricity. Even electricity from inefficient coal-fired power stations is better than burning wood and dung in these poorly flued fires. The outdoor air pollution you get is much less toxic than the indoor air pollution that these people are being affected by. So the question then is whether it's morally defensible to divert money and human effort and other resources away from the real problems that exist today and towards the carbon control which is being advocated. It seems to me that that's hardly a sustainable solution. Thank you.